Not all organisms have the same type of life cycles as humans. Plants can reproduce in many ways, including cuttings, spores, and pollen. Today, I want to talk about meiosis and mitosis and the lifestyle of different organisms. So, the previous lessons all involved human or mammalian sexual reproduction and the mitosis and meiosis patterns that those go through. But they are different in different organisms. So mitosis is the key mechanism involved in asexual reproduction. So if the parent organism produces a genetically identical offspring, like in budding or producing a runner, that would be asexual reproduction using mitosis. Sexual reproduction involves the production of gametes through meiosis. And then fertilization has to follow between the gametes to produce offspring with the correct number of chromosomes. So most animals reproduce sexually, though there are many other organisms that have a wide variety of different life cycles. So here we have meiosis, where sperm and an egg are produced, fertilization occurs, a zygote is formed, and then mitosis continues until you're a fully functioning and fledged human being. And between fertilization and meiosis, all those cells are diploid, but between meiosis and fertilization, the cells are haploid. So in prokaryotic reproduction, this happens in bacteria. They use a process called binary fission. And the bacterial cell replicates its DNA and distributes one copy of each to its two daughter cells. And all the offspring are identical. And then conjunction can occur, which allows for the bacterial cells to adapt to certain conditions. So conjunction would be absorbing other DNA into their DNA to allow them to survive in different conditions. So other methods of asexual reproduction include budding, which is creating a complete but miniature version of the parent plant, which would then continue to grow. Vegetative runners, vegetative reproduction, which is like runners or creeping stems, where an offshoot of the parent plant produces a small plant, which then will grow its own root system into the ground, and then you can trim that runner and have completely physically separate plants that are genetically identical. Fragmentation, which is reproduction through cuttings, where you can create new plants from a fragment of the parent plant. And a really interesting one is parthenogenesis, where an unfertilized egg develops into an adult. So depending on what species, parthenogenesis happens for different reasons. Some that reproduce sexually will reproduce asexually if there's a lack of males in the vicinity for population control, and other cases because of an abundance of resources. So they're just able to reproduce through parthenogenesis because there's a lot of resources. So in natural mating, we have the sperm and the egg that each carry half of the chromosomes. The sperm will enter the egg, and we now have a fertilized cell or a zygote with one maternal and one paternal set of chromosomes forming the complete genome. But in parthenogenesis, rather than having that last meiotic division, separating the cell into two different haploid cells, those two haploid cells stay together. We have two copies of the maternal genome, creating a diploid zygote. So we don't have that second telophase cytokinesis of meiosis 2, so we maintain two haploid cells together. So it's an embryo that has one genetic parent. So another type of life cycle is using spores, which contain genetic material and are released by the parent to grow. So spores, incidentally, are diploid cells for plants. So they don't need to be fertilized. They've already been fertilized. They're, in essence, zygotes. And another plant reproduction method is known as the alternation of generation. So the life cycle of many plants has two generations, a haploid generation and a diploid generation. And the diploid generation is called the sporophyte, and the haploid generation is called the gametophyte. So gametes are haploid. And this occurs in ferns, mosses, and conifers. So here we can see the top half of this diagram is haploid because it's represented by the N. We have a single copy of the different, we have half of the genetic material of the diploid cells. And these individual gametophytes, then the spores will undergo mitosis, producing additional haploid organisms, which then will join together in fertilization, become a zygote, which will then become an individual sporophyte, which will then undergo meiosis to make more spores, and the cycle continues. Okay, here's our moss cycle. So we have the gametophyte in the top, and we can see we have moss that looks like moss is the gametophyte, and that is completely normal. We have some male ones, some female ones. We have haploid sperm and haploid eggs. Once they are fertilized, we have a diploid zygote. And then we have the 2N at the bottom left there, sporophyte, growing up until it has that kind of flower on the top where meiosis occurs. It makes individual spores, which then would become gametophytes and then growing into mosses of their own. Now here we have the conifer, alternation of generation. So the mature sporophyte can be ovulatory cones or become pollen cones, which then will undergo meiosis to make individual pollen. Those are the male gametophytes. And in the female cone, they undergo meiosis to become a megaspore. And they're contained in the cones. If fertilization occurs, then a diploid embryo is formed, which then would become a seed for a conifer. So some life cycles alternate between sexual and asexual reproduction phases, and this can occur in some jellyfish and anemones in the phylum Cnidaria, and they alternate between sexual and asexual forms of reproduction depending on what's available to them at the time. So here we have a planula going through asexual reproduction forming a polyp, or sexual reproduction when it would produce gametes and then they'd be mixed together in fertilization to form a zygote. So thanks for joining on our lesson on alternate forms of reproduction. Hope you enjoyed.